Mental health is not a privilege. Mental health is a right. And my purpose, because my life was saved, is to take this condition of mental illness and turn it into a cause, like breast cancer, like any kind of chronic illness. Because when something is a cause, stigma cannot attach to it.
Everybody, welcome to this week's edition of the Adapt You podcast. As a mental health speaker, educator, and trainer, David Woods Bartley has seen his fair share of successes and setbacks, from directing a nationally recognized non-for-profit to battling a life-threatening mental illness. It was that latter mental illness, a brutal knockdown, a drag-out fight with clinical depression that led David to his suicide attempt. Thanks to life-saving support of a great many people and being shown the necessity of putting one's self-care on a pedestal, David continues the important yet still challenging journey from the isolation of mental hellness, as he calls it, to the inclusive space of mental wellness. David is committed to moving the conversation about mental illness and suicide from the dark shadows where they now live to the forefront of public concern. In doing so, his mission is to shine light on the crisis and open doors to the possibility of mental health for everyone, everywhere. Currently, David is a member of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, the International Association for Youth and Mental Health, National Storytelling Networks, Healing and Story Alliance, and Active Minds. David holds certifications in mental health first aid for adults and youth, Safe Talk, which is suicidal awareness for everyone, and suicide prevention techniques known as QPR, question, persuade, and refer. David is presented to audiences and organizations across the globe, including a phenomenal TEDx talk. If you can find it, we'll put it in the show notes for you to check it out. Giving in-person and virtual keynote speeches and workshops on the topics of mental health, suicide awareness, culture, leadership, and life-saving power of connection, which we're going to talk about very, 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 very much in this podcast, that power of connection in David's story. So David's purpose is to move mental illness from a misunderstood condition to a heroic cause. And the coolest thing about David's approach and the way in which he shares his stories is he uses his experience in a nonprofit animal shelter space to tell the stories of suicide and to give the examples of, how to approach it through using animals and using analogies through animals. So he's a phenomenal storyteller. We'll get an opportunity to hear him here in this podcast, show us how he does that. And with that said, let's bring David on. All right, everybody, welcome David to the Adapt You podcast. David, what is up, my man? Thank you so much for being on the show today and giving us some of your time.
Derek, thank you so much, brother. Thank you so much for the honor of being with you. And thanks for what you're doing to help so many people. As I believe, the people who listen to your podcast, you don't just serve them, it's the people that they in turn touch. So really, what you're doing serves, it'll go in perpetuity. So to be on your show I am so jazzed.
Awesome, man. I'm so stoked. And actually, let me just one little disclaimer about David. He actually has a podcast co-host on his lap by the name of Heaven. So Heaven is on his lap right now. And probably wondering what is Heaven that is on his lap. Let's just be clear. That's a dog. Is Heaven, and his dog is there. So if we see Heaven, we get a look at Heaven or what? We can get a little
Absolutely. Here we go.
There's Heaven. All right.
6-month-old, 100% deaf Boston Terrier, and I'm a Boston Terrier freak, which you will. And here we go. There's Heaven right there.
And there's Heaven. All right, Heaven. Do you have anything to say to that? Guess Heaven can't hear me, so I guess we'll wait for Heaven to chime in throughout the show.
Excellent.
So, David, as discussed in the intro, your journey has been incredible to where you once were, as a suicide survivor. to where you are today, and just the incredible work you're doing with individuals out there that are dealing with mental health, to be able to walk them and through the journey to get to the other side, to get out of what you labeled mental hellness instead of mental illness. And it's unbelievable what you've been able to accomplish. So I kind of want to go back to the beginning. I want to rewind back. Let's talk about your journey. Let's start from the beginning. Let's start about talk about that time in your life where it brought you to that attempt, and let's talk about the pain.
Absolutely. So, my journey, it's almost exactly 10 years ago, Derek, which blows my mind. It was August 31st, 2011. And it was the day that I was going to kill myself. And for me, as I like to explain it in my talks, it was the day that the monster, as I call clinical depression, had finally on that day, Derek, after close to 40 years of passionately trying, convinced me beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was worthless and useless, that I was ugly and pitiful and grotesque and stupid, that I'd become an embarrassment and a burden to the people in my life. And the most damning thing was the belief, albeit illogical, but for me, it was the truth that everybody in my then life would be far better off if I would just kill myself. And so I was living, and still do, about 30 minutes east of Sacramento in Northern California. And so I remember here in Northern California at the end of August, there's no chance of rain. There's almost never a cloud in the sky. I was living with my former wife, Deanna, who's still a very good friend of mine, on a beautiful 2.5 acre parcel in this little town called Penryn. And I remember, Derek, waking up on that morning, walking around the property, almost like to take snapshots with my mind, to take with me wherever I was going. Sat down at the computer, typed out my suicide note, and then, without telling anybody where I was headed, made this relatively short 20-minute drive from my home in Penryn to what's called the Forest Hill Bridge. Now, everybody knows the Golden Gate Bridge. Forest Hill Bridge is about 2 hours east, and it's 730 feet tall. It's 500 feet further off the ground than its more famous cousin. And
Really?
so,
Oh, wow.
It's huge. It is incredible. It towers over what they call the North Fork of the American River. And at this point, I always like to tell people that suicide is almost never spontaneous. And I'd been plagued with suicidal ideations for, at that point, close to 4 decades. I was 48 at the time. And not only had I thought about it, Derek, I had traveled to this bridge many times, so much so that I knew exactly where I was going to park. And so I was driving a red Dodge Dakota pickup truck, which I think about now, even my vehicle is flashing like emergency, need help. Exactly. Right. It's even better said. Thank you. Parked my vehicle, turned off the engine, placed my hands on the 10 and 2 position of the steering wheel, closed my eyes for just a moment, then opened them, reached over, grabbed the note, placed that right squarely in the center of the dash, keys out of the ignition, those in the center of the note, exit, turn back to my right just to make sure the door's unlocked, turn back the other way, cross over the road, and then come to the closest end of the bridge. The bridge is 2,000 feet long. If you Google Forest Hill Bridge, Derek, the view is spectacular. But all I looked at, my sole focus, was a light post right in the middle of 1,000 feet away. Make my way there, turn to my left, suicide barrier hits me right across my chest, bend over without taking in the view, focus on the spot of water in the North Fork of the American River, and then become fixated on that spot to the extent that here, almost 10 years later, I don't know how long I stood there, but thankfully it was long enough for a passing driver to have that same feeling that we've all had. You look upon a situation and think, something's not right with this picture. There's a man bent over the rail. And this person, right, she picks up the phone, calls 911, and a deputy from Placer County approaches me from the left-hand side and does 2 things. First thing he does is establish contact, and that's logistical. But then he created connection, which is life-saving, because connection creates hope, and hope is the thing that saves lives. And so ultimately I was taken off the bridge to an emergency room and then to a psychiatric ward where I would be there for the next 15 life-changing days. My time in the psych ward was extraordinary, and I know that's not always the case. And when people found out I was there and why, they could not wrap their head around it. It made no sense at all, because they didn't see me as clinically depressed or suicidal. People saw me as one half of a committed couple that ran, if you'll forgive me, this kick-ass, amazing animal sanctuary called A Chance for Bliss. And the sanctuary, if you love animals, you would have loved it. It was home to as many as 100 animals at any one time, 25 horses, 23 dogs, 9 potbelly pigs, goats and sheep and ducks and geese and bunnies and birds. And so people didn't see me like as the classic picture or didn't fulfill the definition or the embodiment of mental illness. But especially with mental illness, and I think grief and loss are the same, that sometimes what hurts the most can't be seen. Sometimes great despair and soul-killing agony lies, in my case, just behind a forced smile, a distracting joke, or a seemingly perfect and ideal life. Like, who wouldn't want to run an animal sanctuary? And so not even my former beloved, because I was a great actor and could hide behind the velocity of my life, not even Dee knew, but there I stood on a dark spot on a tall, tall bridge, one moment from killing myself, but my life was saved. And as I like to share, as you put, thank you, that on a day I thought I would kill myself, it was instead the first day of a new life and the first steps in what has now been a 10-year journey away from mental hellness into our birthright. Mental health is not a privilege. Mental health is a right. And my purpose, because my life was saved, is to take this condition of mental illness and turn it into a cause, like breast cancer, like any kind of chronic illness. Because when something is a cause, stigma cannot attach to it.
So David, that's an incredible journey to talk about, that experience that you so vividly described and so beautifully described. I almost felt like I was there on that bridge with you as you're leaning over and looking and contemplating this to where, you stand today and want to make this a cause. I want to back up in that moment for a second and sort of ask you a couple of questions about, how you got to that point. Because you mentioned 4 decades of depression, right? Of mental illness that led up to that point. I think it's important for people to understand, like you said, suicide is not a spontaneous act, right? It's something that is sort of takes time to build up that, I guess, courage in a way. It's an odd term to be able to make and to take that step. What kind of helped me understand, like, how you got there, like what brought you to that point? Because it's such a profound moment. And the fact that really no one around you really, here's a guy that, is doing just God's work and taking care of pets and it's a beautiful shelter. And that's amazing. You'd be the last person I would think would feel in that way because you're surrounding yourself with, folks like heaven who are sitting in their lap right now. Right. So kind of help me understand that a little bit better because so other people can understand and maybe see some of the signals that lead up to that.
No, it's a great question. So I'm going to take you all the way back to the time when I was 7. And actually, I'll explain it this way. A little bit shorter version is when I was in the psychiatric hospital, on the second day I was there, Derek, I sat with this extraordinary person and he was a psychiatrist. And I remember when he came in, it was like his positive vibes preceded him. Now, you wouldn't expect that. And he was dressed very much like you and me. It just no stethoscope, no clipboard. And he didn't come in and start to ask clinical questions, like he wasn't checking things off. Instead, we just had this dialogue. We learned about the animal sanctuary. And he said, "Oh my God, I love dogs." And so then he had to switch and he asked me 2 questions, and this will give you more of the history part. Is he said, "David," the first question was, "David, do you have any history of mental illness in your family?" And I thought, and I said, "Well," I said, "Doctor, I remember my grandfather, my father's father, ended his life by suicide when my father was very young. And while my father died when I was very young, my brothers, my 3 older brothers, Jim, Tom, and John, had shared with me that our dad was just horrifically clinically depressed and was one of the early patients for ECT back in the late 60s. And then the doctor says, "Now, David, realize you're dealing with a medical condition." Okay, I'd never heard what I was dealing with in this kind of empirical scientific term. So that was interesting to say the least. And then he said, because of that, you can inherit the gene, the genetic predisposition. But if you imagine genetics like dry kindling, in this case, something has to light it. And he said, "David, oftentimes the match is trauma." And I will never forget, Derek, this doctor, who I can't remember his name, shifted in his seat, and like his vibes like went to the next level, and his listening and his intention went to the next level. And it was a great definition of compassion that said it's curiosity without assumption. And so like the room that we're in a psych ward is flooded with compassion. And he said, David, have you experienced any trauma? And again, 48 years old, my mind goes blank. And he picks up on the nonverbal clues, and he said, we said you were young when your father died. How old were you? And I said, I was 7. And he said, David, I am so sorry. That's traumatic. For a boy to lose his father, that's incredibly traumatic. And then he said, Derek, has there been anything else? And there had been something so horrific that hung on me like a heavy coat that I had never shared with anybody else. But there was something about the energy of that man in that place that created this safe, albeit sacred ground that I felt okay to share. And I said, Doctor, when I was 11, I was brutally sodomized and violated and raped by a Boy Scout leader.
Wow.
And what was interesting and just really holy is that there was this silence between when I responded. And it didn't occur to me that he didn't hear it. It was much more he was thinking what would be the most appropriate way to respond.
Yeah.
And what he did is he actually, Derek, again, in this place that you wouldn't think, reached forward and held my hands. And he said, David, I am so sorry. He said, David, realize depression and suicidal ideations, these are not your choice. You didn't choose your genetics and you didn't choose your trauma. But then he said 4 words, which still, every time I share them, it's like a birthday gift. He looked at me and he said, it's not your fault. And I couldn't understand that. It was like I could see his mouth moving, but the words, I couldn't hear him, because it's the polar opposite of what I believe.
Of what you felt.
Right. And so he repeats it again. So in terms of the story, if you can imagine, as a 7-year-old boy and then an 11-year-old boy, when I think about it now at 48, is I had this despair, this self-loathing, this self-hatred, this weight on me my entire life. But I was a compliant kid. I really tried to move attention away from me. And I didn't want anybody to ask the questions about like, how are you really? So it's easy for me. It was just like, stay out of focus, kind of be the happy-go-lucky kid, and then cry in the bedroom or cry in the bathroom. And then, you ultimately just get tired. And then probably the most difficult thing, somebody attempts suicide like me, or unfortunately complete suicide. And they're obvious, this whole slate of why questions. Like, why on earth would David want to kill himself? Why on earth would David think that he was useless and worthless? Why on earth would David think that our lives would be better off without him? Why on earth would David be so selfish? Why on earth would David have us destroy our lives? And the reason, I think the simplest answer comes in a quote from the great chef David Chang in his book, in which he talks about his bipolar experience, in which the chef says, when you're depressed, you're convinced that everything you think is true. So when you're depressed, everything you think is true. Now, Derek, you and I have had bizarre thoughts that come into our mind, and we think, okay. But imagine every one of those thoughts, especially the negative ones, we attach to those to think that they're the truth. And so in answer to the difficult question of why, that's the answer. And I'm not saying it assuages the level of confusion and grief, especially for the souls who are in the aftermath of someone who ends their life. But that's really the reason. And so you live with this, for me, it was just this incredibly acute self-hatred. And hatred's not even a strong enough word. Wow. The point where it just, and I still have my days. I still have days when the monster is holding me right around my neck and just wants to shake me to death. But they're days, they're not weeks, they're not months, they're not years, because of this aspect of self-care. But long-winded answer to your question, it's the cumulative fatigue in being in the octagon with a multifaceted monster and you have no chance to tap out. And you just finally say, I'm done. And I for one, don't think people die from mental illness. They die from hopelessness, because ultimately that's where the monster wants to get you. If there's no hope, why live? Especially coupled with the fact that you think then that what you are about to do, I'm not saying it's logical, but what you are about to do is the most selfless thing. Let me give this final gift that I have control over to my family so that they can be better if I would just kill myself. Hopelessness plus that sort of justification and belief, unfortunately, it makes sense in that moment. I'm not saying it's realistic. I'm not saying it's logical, but in that moment to the soul, it makes sense.
I mean, the reality is we are our perceptions and our beliefs, right? So the story that we keep telling ourselves in our head and what we repeat shapes our reality. It shapes our beliefs, and our beliefs shape our actions. And it can continue to spiral in one direction or another. And you talk about that word hopelessness, which is amazing, because I had the opportunity to have another individual on a podcast not that long ago who was also had suicidal thoughts, and he was in a bathtub. He had just slit an artery and he was bleeding out, and he decided to make a change and to stop, because for the first time in that moment, for whatever reason, he had hope. And the hope was he had visions of his kid. He had visions of him being successful. He saw a future that was not dim and grim. I mean, he was to the point where he was duct taping every bit of light that was coming through his bedroom, and just, he wanted complete darkness and solitude, shut the world out, and wanted to end it because it aligned with the belief and what you said, the story that that continued to perpetuate inside of his mind. And the lack of hope is interesting, because that's what you described as feeling. I'm so glad you explained that, because I know there's many people that either feel that way now, or have felt that way, or one day will feel that way. And I think it's important for people. I mean, David, wouldn't you agree, to recognize some of these signals through your process and your journey that you just described?
Absolutely, Derek, 100%. And I just taught a class yesterday. And one of the things in terms of, what are the signs to look for? And it's really people showing up, or in the clinical sense, presenting differently. Mm-hmm. But the other thing that I say as a qualifying factor is realize these signs can be so subtle, it is incredibly easy to miss them. And what I'm trying to do is to take away any sense of shame that people have to say, oh my God, I didn't realize he was suffering. It says, you know what? It's very likely you didn't, because that person, he or she, was very intent in you not seeing their suffering. Because if we let you see our suffering, that means we have to become vulnerable to you. We have to expose our soft underbelly. And then we're afraid that what we say to you, me at a middle-aged man, if I share with you that I cry most days, that I don't feel very masculine, that I feel like I haven't added up, if I share those things with me, you are going to disown me and I'll lose everything that I have.
And that's what you believed, right? That's
exactly.
that's what the mind kept telling you over and over and over again, when in reality, vulnerability is beautiful, right?
Well, if you look at exactly what the great Dr. Brené Brown says, is it's actually a strength. It just, that vulnerability, the authenticity, the intimacy of expression. And I think especially now, and I would imagine given your great work, you would believe that, we are so hungry for some experience of authenticity from another soul that we cross paths with. And it's counterintuitive. I mean, it's really if I share actually how I feel, we will actually become connected. When you would think, the last thing I want to do is share with my brother Derek the depth of self-hatred I feel, because Derek's going to think I'm a wimp, and we will never have that.
And there's a great book, you mentioned a few, called The Mask of Masculinity by Lewis Howes, where he really talks about the social conditioning that men go through, in particular when it comes to showing weakness, expressing their feelings, being vulnerable. It's just we wear these masks to stop ourselves from doing that, right? And that leads to so many problems, right? And it leads to an analogy that I heard of, which is, imagine you take one of those big blow up beach balls, those big beach balls that you hit around in a pool, and you try to bring it underwater, right? And you keep trying to jam it down and keep it underwater, and you're trying to hold on to that ball, and it wants to squirt back up. And you can hold it down there for a while, right? And you can get it down there for a bit, but eventually it's going to win. And when it comes squirting out and it comes shooting out of the water, it's going to go in a weird direction. It's going to be violent, and water is going to be all over the place. So if you continue, the analogy naturally is we're suppressing those emotions. We're jamming them down. We're shoving them down. And when they do come out, when they do manifest, when they do erupt, they can be in a very tragic way. And that's in the, form of, an extreme case, suicide.
No, and I agree with you. And so Matt Haig, amazing author who wrote several books, and the one that really impacted me was Reasons to Live. And I read this, within the last couple of years. So I've been, researching and doing work and everything else, but he said something, and Lewis is doing phenomenal work in this area of masculinity and trying to change the story. What Matt says is, here's the 3-step process: is dark thoughts lead to overwhelming emotions, which trigger adverse actions. So it just spins. And there's why my belief is that connection creates hope, and hope saves lives. Because what happens is, you and I'm having a good day today, but yesterday wasn't as good. So I was having some depression. Let's say we were talking yesterday. In the hour that I would have been with you yesterday, all of the depression, all of the negative thoughts would have gone away, because I would have been, as I am today, in connection with you. Our minds cannot hold competing thoughts. There's no way in this conversation with you, which is fantastic. I hope you feel the same way.
I completely agree.
I can't think about the depression. I can't even feel this. I'm connected with a new friend, a new brother. So that's why I think while the problem of mental illness is very complex, the solution is actually incredibly simple. And I'm not saying that for any other reason than to provide people with a sense of hope that it's accessible. If we go through our lives and make moment by moment by moment connection, no matter what, and I teach different ways, we are going to be in a better place. So so that's why I tell people, so imagine a bomb. And we've all seen those movies, and it's at the last second, you cut the red wire or the blue wire. Well, with connection, it doesn't matter. Connection doesn't matter what the color is. It diffuses the bomb because it breaks up that circuitry of thought, emotions, and actions. You're just cut. And the first responder who approached me, my belief is the most direct path we can take to overcoming our collective fears around mental illness is to leverage the power of curiosity to create understanding. Because the opposite of fear is not calm. The opposite of fear is understanding. The more we understand, the less we fear. And understanding is the only thing that facilitates choice. So the first question out of his mouth after contact, he sits down next to me and he looks at me and he said, "David, what does it feel like to be depressed?" What? and I'm blessed to talk to a lot of police officers, thousands over the last 10 years. And what I say to police officers, I say, brothers and sisters, use curiosity like this additional resource on your utility belt, because what happens is everything decelerates. And the key to keeping people safe on the safe side of the rail is to slow things down. Then he followed up with, he said, "David, how long have you lived with this condition?" And then the most amazing counterintuitive question was, "Derek, what's it like on your worst days?" And then he just listened. And there's a great quote with the power of listening. And he used the 3-question rule: question, listen, listen to the response. Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen wrote this great book called Kitchen Table Wisdom. And she says, our listening creates a sanctuary for the homeless parts within another person. So on that bridge, I had a physical dwelling to live, but I was mentally homeless and spiritually homeless. And this soul asked those questions, and then he pivoted on what I say a half a mustard seed size, not of faith, but of hope, because that's all you need. And he said, "What's it like on your best days?" And he said, "What do you want the rest of your life to look like?" And it was just like your the other amazing, I'm sure this other man is incredible, that little little teeny little place of hope. And I looked up, and then I turned to my left and retraced my steps. And here was the exclamation point on the experience. Middle-aged man, a middle-aged man. He didn't say, "Hey man, wait a man up." What he said to me, Derek, was, "Thank you for telling me how you feel."
It's so wild to think that, and you said it's such a simple solution, that just asking a series of relatively simple questions to get you to feel comfortable enough to be able to share your feelings, how that just completely can pivot a situation, right?
Absolutely.
And that's why, you see so many people now investing in practice such as journaling and just mindfulness practices to be able to get that out, right? To get that out. That's why we have friends that we chat with. But in your situation, just the fact that he came in just wearing his t-shirt, didn't have the lab coat and stethoscope, made you feel comfortable immediately. And honestly, it sounds like the reason you answered him, I have to imagine he just connected with you because he seemed like he cared, right? There was a connection there. Because had he come in with a different demeanor, do you think you would have had a different response? Like if the lab coat walked in and started taking a little bit of a different approach, do you feel you would have had the similar results?
No, not at all. And not only with him, then with the officer who responded on the bridge, same thing. It was just, energy obviously is invisible, and yet it's very palatable. I mean, we can
So palatable.
So I think it's this. If you look at what Matt Haig wrote, and I so believe it, it's these thoughts, emotions, and actions. What I've come to know is, and here's what these two souls did so beautifully, is they knew that curiosity slows the speed of thought. So a person in that situation is just spinning. I mean, their mind is just racing. And then all of a sudden, if somebody poses an authentic question, you are compelled, because you pick up that, like, this dude really wants to hear my answer, your mind slows. And if things slow down, you have a greater likelihood. Does it work in every instance? No, unfortunately it doesn't. We are still going to lose people to suicide. There is a push for what they call a zero suicide. I really don't think that's going to happen, but we can reduce the loss of souls down to a level it's still, the loss of one single person to suicide is horrific. Right now, we're at close to 50,000. I mean, 5 every hour. In the world, it's 1 every 40 seconds. The 5 every hour is in the United States. We will reduce that number because it's going to become a cause. We still lose heroic women to the condition of breast cancer. And the reason I want to say my belief that I don't think we're ever going to get to a zero sum in regards to suicide, I want to have people manage their expectations, because when we reduce those numbers, I don't want people to be disappointed. Like, because then you're going to throw all the success and say, well, we didn't achieve our goal. Like, okay, but what if we got it from 50,000 down to 40,000, down to 30,000, down to 10,000, down to 5? And then, because we have changed the condition to a cause, and we look at the people who fight this battle, and they're heroes, they're warriors, much like the incredibly courageous women who battle breast cancer.
I think it's an unbelievable approach to take it from a condition to a cause for the very reason, I mean, it labels it differently. And I think it allows people to also feel more comfortable opening up about it. Right. And I think that's a big part of it. And the way in which you phrase it, and I'm going to go back to here for a second, when you said that, when you're in that depressive sort of spiral and things are spinning and spinning, you're telling yourself the same things over and over and over. I'm worthless. I'm useless. I just want to end it. The fact that I think you used the term or the word curiosity slows things down. While you're saying that, I was thinking about that. I was like, you know what, you're really right, because now I have to stop and answer your question. Right. Exactly. So I like all this other juice that's flowing around in my dome has to stop for a second. I actually have to engage with you and answer that question. And it's such a simple concept, but what a great one for people that are listening right now, to take that away with, individuals that are out there. Maybe you might save a life with a simple question, right?
No. Exactly. And if I may, here's the other part that when I've thought about this so many different times, and both of these extraordinary people. And you know what's fascinating, Derek, is they leverage questions of what and how. They never asked a why question, and they never asked a when question. And I thought about that. I'm like, that's brilliant. Because what happens when you and I are asked a why question? You know, I think it's almost impossible for us not to get defensive, you know. And so if the doctor or the first responder says, you know, why are you depressed? You know, as opposed to what does depression feel like? How does it feel? As opposed to when are you going to feel better? When are you going to go see the therapist? When are you going to take your medication? As to how can I help you? What can I do to have you feel supported? How do you feel on your worst days? And it's just the what and how are so neutral that, to your point, which you beautifully put, you're going to increase the likelihood that somebody is going to respond to the question. And then they're going to, because curiosity slows the speed of thought. In that moment, you have, with that question, snipped the wire. You have diffused the bomb, at least momentarily, because they're connected.
It's incredible. So for those folks, you do an immense amount of unbelievable work right now for people that struggle with these conditions as you try to change this from a condition. I should say try, as you are on your way to successfully changing this from a condition to a cause. Talk to me a little bit about the work that you've been doing and what you're up to and some of the services that you provide and value they provide to those that are out there. So we get a greater understanding of how you once went from, you know, staring over at the water on this bridge to now you are helping people in similar situations.
You know, what I first will say is, you know, I am blessed with amazing people. And these amazing people were in my life before. I had made up, though, something that was false because I believed it, that they wouldn't understand, they wouldn't believe it. But the reality is they would. And then my psychiatrist is literally become like a dad to me. My therapist is amazing. My peer support groups, my meds work. I've been taught to put self-care on a pedestal. So the sanctuary that my former wife, Deanna, and I think I mentioned, we're still really good friends. It doesn't exist. And this really is a tragic story. I got out of the hospital in about the middle of September of 2011. By the end of that year, I had lost everything. And without judgment, and I've let go of anger, it's the people, because we had become really well known. I mean, at one point we were the cover story in the life section of USA Today. But people thought, if the co-founder is going to end his life by suicide, they can't do that work anymore. So I remember very clearly, here, Mr. Repo Man, here's my keys. The animals were, for the most part, all taken away, lost the home to foreclosure and marriage ended. So by December 31st of that, 10 weeks after being let go out of the hospital, everything changed. I mean, it was worse. And there's a quick story that I'll go on a quick tangent and then circle back. I made a friend in the psych hospital, another middle-aged man, his name was Don. When he got out, he found this men's depression support group. It was a group of middle-aged guys that met every Tuesday from 6 to 8 p.m. And almost immediately I joined that group. From that group, I met my current psychiatrist, my current therapist, got on meds and everything else. So that happened almost immediately. Then you fast forward to December 31st. Had I not had all that experience of connection from the time I got out, come December 31st, we wouldn't be here together because there's no way I would have survived. And so what I do now is I take this subject, which is really daunting, and I wrap it in animal stories. So I now, with the blessing of Zoom, which wasn't a blessing at first, because I lost all my speaking gigs, I talk all over the world right now. And really, I'm a storyteller. And so I use probably 30 different stories of animals, and they're not told for just the cute factor. They actually have a really, really specific purpose. And if you want, I'll give you a short one right now.
I love one. So before you get into it, because that's fascinating to me, is that, so you tell the story, you help people with your journey by melding your love for animals with your experiences and wrap it in a story, which is one of the best ways to get a message across because people love stories.
Right.
So yeah, that that's phenomenal approach. So please, yes, share a story as you would on one of these Zoom meetings or on stage.
Oh, okay, thank you. So here's one that I think is really appropriate for what we're talking about now. So behavior oftentimes doesn't make sense. And I think, brother, if you're the same like me, there's been times that we've acted in a way that makes no sense to anybody else. Like, Derek, David, what are you doing? They might say it a little more, they wouldn't use an acronym.
A couple more F-bombs in there. Yeah. Yep.
Thank you, the WTF. But isn't it true for you, I would imagine like me, there's always an internal condition, something, there's a story, there's a condition that's influencing the behavior. So one day we get a call and there's a goose that needs to be adopted. And we already had this beautiful pond in the back, and we had Mercy and Grace, who were geese, and we had Dave, who was an injured duck, who thought he was a goose. So Adia, the new goose, Adia, A-D-I-A, he was an African goose, and a friend of ours named him Adia, which is Swahili for beautiful. So I bring this beautiful goose, and he liked to be held, which was unusual. Bring him, Derek, right to the edge of the ideal circumstance in which a goose was created to experience. This beautiful pond, and the sanctuary was spotless. But instead of going into that which he had been created for, he didn't swim to be with Mercy, Grace, and Dave. Instead, he jumped into this bathtub-sized water trough that the farm animals drank. So we can bring somebody right to the cusp of counseling and therapy and medication and peer support and everything else, but we're confused. We don't understand, why would they jump back into the small confines of their suffering? So I look at Adia and I'm like, okay, dude, you might be stressed. It's a little too much. Pick him out of the water trough, put him back on that edge. And I remember he looked really intently at it. Mercy, Grace, Dave, water trough, me, jumps back in. I'm like, dude, you're killing me. Do this. We do this like 10 times, back and forth. Now, because I'm not evolved in a situation where I don't understand other people's behavior, I go from, that's kind of odd, to, all right, you're being a little annoying. Okay, now I'm getting frustrated. I might even move to the place of anger because I got other stuff I got to do. So Deanna, brilliant Deanna, looks upon the scene that her beloved husband is just like, woo, it's like, honey, it's going to be okay. Maybe there's something we don't know about Adia. So she goes and makes a call to the rescue organization and comes back and says, sweetheart, guess what I found out? Adia had lived his whole life in the small confines of somebody's backyard. Not only had Adia never seen a pond, Derek, he had only ever swum in a teeny little kiddie pool. And you're like,
oh, makes sense.
Now, and here's the great thing about when we understand something. In the space of understanding, solutions and possibilities and results come. Because in that moment, I'm like, dummy, you can just get a second water trough, one for Adia, one for the others. So I sat down there just like, okay, this is amazing, kind of taking in. Adia swimming in the water trough, Mercy, Grace, and Dave are doing those things. 5 minutes later, Adia jumps out of the water trough, walks around my back, Derek, and sits down right next to me. And I was just waiting for him to put his wings around me. 5 minutes after that, he stands up, walks back to the edge one more time, on the cusp of everything that was perfectly created for him. And he looks out at Mercy, Grace, Dave, again to the water trough, again to me, eyes front, and swims into the pond. Because understanding is like this energetic vortex, which will draw people in to experience what they were created for. People who are not moving towards the resources in regards to mental health, oftentimes it's because of the story that we don't understand. And unless people feel connected, and understanding is a primary way to have people connected, they're never going to move towards that which they have been created for. And I love the image to this day, every time I tell the story, that this beautiful goose needing a new home, having had this limited background, moving towards that which he was created for, he swam to go be in the presence of Mercy and Grace. And Dave. Dave was there too, but it doesn't work as well with Dave. So there's like 20 or 30 of those stories, and everybody loves the story of a goose or a dog or a pig or a goat or a sheep. And it allows me to honor Deanna and the amazing soul that she is, and the honor the animals. And to every time I tell a story and there's a positive response, which who doesn't like an animal story? It's one more remnant of shame that still clings to me at times because of the way everything ended. It can just kind of kind of just moves away from it.
What's amazing about the technique is you're right. First of all, I mean, who doesn't love a story about an animal? And it's funny, as you're telling this story, I actually live so my home in my studio, and this window that I'm looking through right now faces a natural spring in front of our home where it's filled with we've got 9 ducks, and we have 4 geese, and now 3 or 4 baby geese, and the nest was like literally like 20 feet from our front door. As you're telling the story, I feel like I could relate to like Dave, because my kids have named all the ducks and the geese. They all got names. We may even have a David out there, to be honest with you. I think it might be a duck. So, and yeah, but what's interesting about a story is it's a great way for people to remember what you're trying to tell them, right? So it is, and in fact, some of the these memory champions, I've read these books on how you can increase your memory. The way in which they memorize these decks of cards and stuff like that is they tether the number and the clubs and all that stuff, and they actually create a very obscure story in their mind to be able to remember it, because they can remember the story, right? So
Exactly.
when you tell a story to make a point, not only is it just a beautiful story, but it's also like those people who are listening can relate to it, they can understand it, and it brings them a deeper connection. So I love your style. I've never heard of that approach before, of using story with animals to be able to help folks that are struggling with this. So kudos to you, man. That is freaking awesome. I love
brother,
it.
and they're fun. I mean, I did a new one yesterday in which we had this duck that had to live inside the house because she had been injured and she couldn't live outside. But of course, Deanna said, well, she can just live in our big jacuzzi tub. And I put her in there, and one day I accidentally hit the whirlpool button, and Darcy, the duck, is just like flying around. I'm like, oh my God, until I shut it off. Well, to make a long story short, she loved the bubbles. She loved the jacuzzi tub. And so the point of the story was, it's important for us to be as open as possible, and to remember, sometimes we don't know what's best for somebody else. Who would have thought an injured duck would have loved spending every single day in a jacuzzi tub? Well, that's just the way that it is. Darcy and Deanna, amazing Deanna, took literally thousands of pictures. So I use PowerPoints, but there's no stats. It's either quotes or pictures. And I have a picture of Darcy. So thank God for
in the hot tub.
Oh my gosh. And then at night we put her in this little dog bed in the master shower that had a glass door, and there was a blanket over. And so I had a picture of just a little Bill hanging out. So they're fun. And I agree. And thank you so much for your acknowledgement. They help me. I hope they help other people.
There's something about a story that just also captivates an audience, right? So, when you go up there and you give a presentation, and like you said, you have statistics and you got this death by PowerPoint, it's really hard to connect with that, right? It's just a complete immediate snooze fest. And when you're dealing with something so emotional, right, and you're dealing with something that is with feelings and with thoughts, it's hard to quantify that, and it's hard to connect with that with statistics and things like that. But if you come at somebody with a story, I love the approach. I think it's absolutely phenomenal. And you've been doing this work now for quite some time, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it was a funny story. This all goes from the gift of meeting with the guys from the men's depression support group, where I did 6. What I would do is I had my therapist appointment from 4 to 5 on Tuesdays, take a break, and then go meet with the boys from 6 to 8. And after I'd been there a year, a friend of a friend approached me and said, the guy's name is Will Taylor. Just talked to Will the other day. And he said, hey, I work for the county where I lived, and they had a speakers bureau. And it was all what they call consumers, which I don't like the word. It's more people with lived experience. And he said, hey, I think you should tell your story. Why? One, why would I want to tell my story? And 2, how would that be beneficial to somebody else? And he said, just trust me, it will. And so Will, I've eclipsed 500 presentations now over the last 9 years. And I literally just talked to Will the other day, texted me out of the blue. And it was all because of this one soul who saw something in me and knew more than I knew that there was something that could come through me and I believe I'm just the voice, I'm not the originator of what comes through, that would be helpful for other people.
Mental illness is something that is such a huge issue across the world and in this country, and it's kind of a silent killer too, right? So it's one of these things that, you hit it very well yourself, right? Not a lot of people knew it. They were surprised when they heard that you did that. I've had loved ones in my family who have made attempts or have found out later that they were depressed. And I had no idea. Sometimes it's a little bit more obvious, but a lot of times it's not, because people are able to put the facade on, like you said, and they're able to sort of, stuff it down, which again, only makes it worse. So the gift that you're giving right now of being able to use story and animals, to be able to connect with individuals, to make them to understand this cause that you have, and to be able to provide people with the tools to maybe help those individuals. It's incredible. You're doing God's work right now in terms of that. And especially now, David, because it is just, I hate to, bring up the pandemic, but the reality is that, the entire world, so many more people have had to deal with so much more hardship in terms of loss of a job, loss of freedoms, loss of loved ones, and it's been tough. So I would imagine, are you a little busier now with all of that's been going on? Are you finding that more are reaching out as things sort of wind down a little bit here? Have you noticed? I'm curious, sort of an uptick in that in light of all that's been going on.
No, I get, and the silver lining, and I mean to say this in the most loving way, is before the pandemic, even with the numbers being what they were in terms of people suffering so horrifically, I had to encourage, if not try to convince, which never works, people to have the conversation around mental health. I don't need to do that anymore. Like, it is like, we don't have to do that. I'm always looking to be booked more. But here's the interesting thing, is the variety of organizations that are now approaching me. There's this amazing company called Beta Rudder. They're an advertising agency in Wisconsin, who reached out to me and says, you know what, we want to talk on mental health. And I remember, Derek, when they first contacted me, I'm like, why are you contacting me? There's the Iowa Credit Union League, a group of credit unions who wanted a training on their managers. Yesterday did a lecture to Northeastern Iowa Community College. It is amazing. Did a talk to one of the counties here in California, and it was sponsored by a brewery who had lost an employee, and they created a beer in his honor, but they wanted to go ahead and have the conversation. So it is amazing, the different types of organizations that are now realizing, okay, we have to handle this, because it's a spiritual cost. It's not how God wants us to live. This is not, I don't know if you've read any of Alexander, is it Alexander Hamilton? He's a United Methodist. He wrote this amazing book called God Only Gives You More Than You Can Handle, and 5 other things that the Bible doesn't say. And it's just this amazing thing about, and this is obviously, we're not having a spiritual conversation, but I think if we go on this slant for just a second, and I'm blessed to talk I'm talking at a church on Sunday, that this is a medical condition that is not a punishment from however you describe the creative force in life. It's not. Just like breast cancer is not a punishment. You are not suffering from this because you're a bad person. You're not. And I think with mental illness, because it impacts the mind, we can become convinced that this is our penance for whatever we did.
It's crazy, the fact that you're getting calls from so many businesses shows that the awareness around this, which is a good thing, is becoming a bit more mainstream, and those are seeking out individuals like companies, you said colleges, credit unions, to be able to give trainings and talks, so that there's more awareness around it within the workforce. Because I think, especially coming, hopefully out of this whole COVID deal, it's obviously a problem, right? So I think it's more rampant. It seems to be that way. So many other people around me that otherwise I would never think were suffering for something like that. You're seeing more outwardly signs of it. So it's great to see organizations are actually taking the bull by the horns and reaching out to professionals like yourself to be able to do that. So and we have a great audience. And I know there are people that are listening right now that could greatly benefit from what it is that you do. And in this new virtual world, it's beautiful. You can sit and do it just like this, and they can get you there in a second because it's virtual.
Exactly.
So with that said, how do people get in contact with you? What's the best way to get in contact with David and to be able to learn more about what you do and bring it into their organization?
So I literally, so email david@davidwoodsbartley.com. And then please feel free. I know you have it. Just give people my cell phone number. I mean, my cell phone number, you can find it on the web in an instant. So I just have to, even if they don't want to hire me, but they just would like to talk. If they're suffering from themselves or they have a soul in their life that's important to them and I don't know what to say, or give me an idea what it feels like. That's my life was saved. My life continues to be supported by extraordinary people. The least I can do is to give back. And that's what I'm here to do. So they can call me, they can email me. I have a whole bunch of different talks. The one that I give most often is the why of suicide and the how of hope. Just like, okay, here's the problem and here's what I think is the solution. But there's all kinds of different stuff. And I love doing it because life's worth living. I didn't believe it was before, but now I know.
Now you know. And so for those that are listening, we'll make sure that we have David's cell phone number, his email, and any ways in which you can, and we'll put some of the posts. I know your TEDx talk, you got another one coming up. So we'll be able to get all your information out there so people can contact you. It'll be in the show notes. I encourage you to reach out to David because obviously he uses the power of a story to be able to send a message, which is unbelievable. So David, I got one last question for you. And it's the same question I ask everybody at the end of every show. And that is, we've talked now for, close to an hour, and you've shared your story and you've shared so many nuggets of information and pearls of wisdom. And honestly, we can talk for hours about a great number of things. And I can just tell that we vibe, so we're able to connect. And we could go on for hours. So people are busy. People listen to these while they're on the fly and, they got a lot of things going on. They're in the car. If they could take one nugget, right? Just one thing away from this show, one pearl they could take with them to make an impact on their life around what you do. It could be something you mentioned or something that we didn't cover. What would that one thing be?
I think if I had to distill it down to one thing, that you can help either yourself or somebody else, because connection is the purest form of reciprocity. That's why it's a component of self-care for me, and something to help everybody else is to leverage curiosity to create understanding. Ask people questions. Ask them, what's the story behind your name? What do you feel like on your best days? What do you feel like on your worst days? And then the other part is become a master of the handwritten note. It is the lost art. And we all know what it's like, Derek, to go to the mailbox in that uniquely sized envelope that's handwritten. We know it's going to be good because if people think we're a butthead, they're going to text us. So the easiest way to say that is leave this time that you have blessed me to be with you with the knowing that connection creates hope, connection created by recognition, understanding, and expression. And that hope saves lives. We are all lifesavers. We do. And we've actually saved lives. We just don't realize it. And it's, as I mentioned to you, it's not just the people that we impact. It goes on into perpetuity.
I love it. Just the art of asking questions, the art of curiosity, getting someone else to open up, getting that pain out of them can save a life. And I've never connected the two until today. And you're a gift to be able to be an awakening of that, because unfortunately, not everyone understands that we have two ears and one mouth, right? As Mama said, I gave you two ears and one mouth for a reason. And so we need to lean on that, right? We need to listen.
Amen,
we need to
brother.
ask questions, and that really does make a difference. David, I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your day. I know you're a busy
brother.
man to be able to come on, and I look forward to having you on again and diving even deeper.
Please.
Absolutely. And hearing more of your stories, because they're awesome. More stories about my ducks and all that, because I think it's such a great way to be able to share your craft. So thanks again, David. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, brother. God bless. Thank you so much.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for listening to the Adapt You podcast today. Our goal with this show and all of our content is to deliver you the guests and the respective knowledge necessary to help you change something in your life. Everyone who listens to this show has something they want to affect and something they want to change. And our goal is to help give you the knowledge necessary to take you down that path on becoming the absolute best version of yourself. If you like what you heard today, please tune in to all of our shows and also check us out in social media. You can find us on Instagram, on Facebook, and check out our website and have some great content on there as well. So thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next show.